Today's World Insight. China has proposed a 5-year plan and long-range objectives through to the year 2035. What are the goals and missions of these plans? Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. Today our program will focus on the 5th Plenary Session of the 19th Communist Party of China's Central Committee and China's 14th 5-year plan. Key policymakers have laid out plans for the nation's development over the next 5 years. A communique released this Thursday revealed the highlights of a 4-day plenary session. The communique outlined details of a growth strategy called a double development dynamic. It will guide policies that will shape the lives of 1.4 billion people. The government has also drawn up its vision for 2035, the deadline to achieve what China calls socialist modernization. Since 1953, the country, China, has outlined its development priorities in these 5-year plans. This year marks the end of the 13th 5-year plan. Despite global troubles made worse by COVID-19, China is prepared to go full steam ahead to meet the goals. So what does the new top-level policy blueprint mean for the country? Could it help bring stability to the world? And how will China work with the others under this very difficult and challenging situations? Let's loop in our panelists from different parts of the world. For the 14th 5-year plan and the latest insights and analysis about it, we are joined in Beijing, Fu Jun, the academic dean of the Institute for South Cooperation and Development with Peking University. In Shanghai, Leslie MAASDORP, vice president of the New Development Bank. And also in Singapore, Jim Rogers, world-renowned investor, chairman of Rogers Holdings. And in Bangkok, last but not least, Jeffrey Towson, Guanghua School of Management scholar with Peking University. Gentlemen, wonderful to see you. Today, everybody is talking about this news, 14th 5-year plan for China. Of course, we would not be able to see the details of it because it would only be available the coming year during China's National People's Congress, but we are reading signs of it through the latest press conferences. So let's go directly into some of these details. Professor Fu, your brief takeaway.
Well, in a way, it's not a surprise to me because you have some theories with which to project forward. The Chinese economy, the growth of Chinese economy is a function of land, labor, capital. Now, with the land, labor going down, we have a pressures on population. The last variable is technology, capital technology. So moving forward, we have to take technology very seriously. In other words, we need to be more innovative for the economy to move forward. And manifested of that variable is we need to raise the quality of our economy. Another way of expressing that, now that we have get the fruits of the low-hanging fruits, and we need to take technology very seriously.
Okay. Mr. Rogers, of course, China's plan, this is about the economy and it's also about social development. You yourself as an investor must be watching very closely about what China aspires to do as the second largest economy in the world. According to the latest information, 2020 GDP number likely to exceed 10 billion yuan. So that, of course, impressive for a year of a pandemic, but still there is going to be challenges for China's economy.
Well, Tian Wei, as you know, China has done a less bad job and actually a better job than nearly every other country in the world during this epidemic. They made it very clear that technology is going to be an emphasis, and I am very keen on Chinese agriculture, and I was very pleased to see that they too, while they're emphasizing technology, they're not forgetting agriculture.
All right. Mr. Towson, of course, your take about the latest plan.
I sort of break it into two buckets. There's a very forward-looking piece, very aggressive, sort of let's go on offense, let's create the new international standards. electric vehicles, 5G, 6G, all of that for what's coming. But then there was also almost what I would consider a defensive aspect of, look, we can't be dependent, or at least overly dependent, on certain aspects of the technology supply chain anymore. And there need to be alternative supply for things like semiconductors in particular. So there was sort of this innovation centerpiece this time, which I thought was particularly noticeable.
Right. Mr. MAASDORP, certainly we have noticed that China has also been planning, even at a time of great change in the world, to deepen its involvement in the international system. Well, coming from where you are, both as an economist and also working for a multilateral investment bank, what does that mean to you?
I mean, as you know, the most important recent development has been the announcement by China at the UN General Assembly that President Xi announced the intention of quality bio before 2060. So there's a huge expectation by the development community to see the path that China intends to travel to achieve that objective. This is one of the most carbon-intensive economies in the world, one of the largest emitters of, in terms of carbon emissions, and therefore it has a huge task ahead of it. So to see the aggressiveness of the plans to move towards that objective is going to be key in the plan. But more importantly, I think the approach that has been taken, Tian, is not to look at that as a drag on the economy, but more in terms of stimulating the new green and sustainable industries. Reference was already made to electric vehicles, green and renewable power. So all of that could be new impetus for further growth in the Chinese economy.
As you have noticed, gentlemen, in the international media reports about China's latest plan, much has to do with China drawing long-term plans while the rest of the world is still struggling with the immediate challenges. But also China is struggling with the immediate challenges. So how do you see, Mr. Towson, that China is trying to wave its latest solutions to the latest challenges into a long-term plan? What do you perceive as some of the biggest challenge in the immediate term?
The planning is not as important as the ability to execute successfully.
Absolutely.
And I think that is kind of where China does stand out, because when it does set these plans, whether it's for building airports or railroads or whatever, it actually does happen. I mean, there are surprises along the way, but it's that ability to execute in the long term, which I find particularly impressive, as opposed to the plan. Jumping out against the COVID and the situation and weaving that together, for me, at least personally, when I look at the scope of what's going on, it does kind of put the COVID situation maybe a bit more in perspective than I had it. That this is maybe not it is a significant issue, but over the course of 5 to 10 years, it may not end up being that big a deal 10 years from now. I shouldn't say not big a deal, but not as big as I think it is perceived right now.
With the pandemic, particularly with geopolitics, there is certain danger some see as certain countries trying to isolate China from the international mechanism, from innovation. So how do you see this, what they call the high-level opening up and cooperation?
Well, unfortunately, you do see some countries, I'm an American, and I hate to say it, you see America closing off more and more these days. I hope that it does not affect other countries, and other countries do not do it. But China says that they're going to continue to open their markets. They have certainly been opening their currency since 2005. They've been opening their markets. I hope they will move faster, because the more competition there is in the world, the better everybody develops. You may not like competition. America right now does not like competition, but competition always leads to great strides forward.
Yes, there is competition. Professor?
PRC has a long history of planning, but there are nuances between the first phase of planning before reforms and opening up. The plan was done by the Planning Commission. Note that very carefully, Planning Commission. Then during the reform and opening period, the big organization was re-engineered into Commission on Development and Reforms, which means even when you have a plan, who will be there to do the planning? Before the planning, that was the state. the executor was the state. After reform, the executor is the growing share of the market, taking the job of that blueprint. But the state also has a role to play. The state will be there to provide what we call the public goods. But that, of course, you have to understand in the dynamic sense. So even though when translated into English, we use the word planning, there are differences. Now, related to that, the opening up process. I'm the biology. I cannot mutate into other stuff very rapidly. It takes time for us to change. And I'm a gradualist, even though I may argue for the speed up of planning, but I am certainly not someone who will say, let's have a shock therapy.
Mr. MAASDORP, geopolitics is complicated, particularly right now. Nobody knows where the world is heading for. It depends on so many moving factors all at the same time. So they are also interacting with one another. We never know. But certainly, we see some signs that could be worrying. For example, technological nationalism. Now, in the U.S., we also see that. For example, the latest decision on the so-called chip, which is a decision to encourage innovation, particularly involving the chips. But the question really is, will China be this, on the one hand, relying on itself to develop latest technologies, but on the other hand, be able to be this factor that is promoting cooperation? Will China, together with other like-minded, be able to do that work?
Thanks, Tian. Very interesting question. I think this sort of old model, this idea, I think it's always important, let me start there, it's always important to learn from historical experience, right? So the most dreadful, inward-looking, nationalist, protectionist experiment we've had was more than 100 years ago in the period between the First and the Second World War, and it led to untold hardship and disaster in the world. We know that as historical fact. Number two, as you know, the world has globalized and have integrated global value chains today. The idea of returning to kind of old models, inward-looking, produce for yourself, is not really something that is feasible in the medium term. So I think that this is more kind of a short-term impulse that you see this talk of inward-looking technological nationalism, as you called it. I think we will revert. We are going through a particularly bad period right now, but I think economic rationale and underlying economic forces will dictate that we return to a model that is more in line with where global prosperity would be heading. That said, I think it is important to also mention, Tianwei, that the old model is not necessarily, hasn't produced significant inequality, as you know. I hope that the final plan will reflect, as it talks about a new growth model, a focus more on quality, focus more on inclusiveness, focus more on green and sustainable. All of this will contribute to a more sort of a long-term part of economic inclusion. So in short, I guess what I'm saying, and I come from a multilateral institution where we can see the limits of looking at the world through your narrow country lenses, whether it's in terms of technology, your own economy, in every single dimension.
Multilateralism, of course, is a key component for the world's over the past few decades since the Second World War. But Mr. Rogers, we know, for example, inside the United States, there were enormous amount of debate, and the presidential election, the campaign season has a lot to do with which direction to go. So how do you see, the biggest economy like the United States, its choices and its positioning China in its overall strategic choices will have an impact on how China will and also look for its own agenda forward?
And as you know, Tianwei, whenever there are problems throughout history, everywhere in the world, politicians blame the foreigners. it's very easy to blame the foreigners. Different skin, different language, different food, different dress, different everything. And that's what's happening in America now. They're blaming the foreigners, but not just the Chinese. They blame everybody, but especially the Chinese now. I presume that this will pass. I hope that this will pass after the election, because so far in the last 30 or 40 years, China and America working together have done a lot. It built a lot of prosperity for themselves and for the world. Look at what's happened in China in the past 40 years, and I hope that China continues that path. Yes, if people hit you in the face every day, sometimes you react, but so far China's shown remarkable restraint to what's happening in the world, and I hope that they continue to open it, as they say they are, and emphasizing technology and agriculture and all the other aspects of Chinese economy and society.
Mr. Rogers, to follow up on that, some of the U.S. Businesses have been critical about China's policies and China's approaches, international property rights and some new technologies, just to name a few. But over the past few years, they have also witnessed some very interesting phenomenon in Washington and how the current administration is trying to handle things with China. So how do you see business circle also going to groping for its balance about politics and not being driven by politics or politicians?
Well, there are millions of business people in the United States, so there's no simple answer. But yes, the politicians blame China for a lot of things. And again, I would say again, I hope China will open up more and more. The financial markets are still too closed, if you ask me. The currency is still too closed, if you ask me. But so far, you've been opening very well for the last 40 years, 15 years especially. I hope that that will continue. Now, yes, if there are areas where China has been doing things that are not on the up and up, obviously, people should sit down and talk about them and solve the problems. They should not get into a fight. Trade wars have never been successful for anybody. History is very clear about that. Mr. Trump either does not know history or thinks he's, well, we know he thinks he's smarter than history. Mr. Trump knows he's smarter than history. But I would hope that most Americans and most American business people know that trade wars are not good, and the best way to solve problems is to talk about them and open up, not fight and close off. The 30s showed us that's not the way to do it.
Yeah, related to that, Mr. Towson, how do you see China's balance in this 14th five-year plan? A lot of terminologies about balance have been mentioned, whether it's about innovation or the opening up of the economy. So at a time when there are a lot of uncertainties, how important are these balances, and what should be the ultimate goals of these balances, and how will others help China and support China in this balance so that they would also benefit from the balance?
Well, the idea of balance is, has been discussed for a long time.
Yes,
Do we just
indeed.
grow GDP at all costs, or is there more consideration for, say, environmental factors? And you've seen that discussion change over the last 10 years. I think what came out this week was this idea of dual circulation a lot more, or double development. Focus on internal circulation, production, consumption, as well as engagement with the world. That type of balance is a natural, I think, reaction to the political situation. I think there's risks in that China's domestic economy is now large, and that's a tremendous advantage for a lot of businesses, whether it's Alibaba or Huawei. It's also a risk because they have the option of withdrawing from the world now in a way they probably didn't have 10 years ago. You could do quite well at home. The risk there is, the most obvious one is the technology companies in particular. They sort of become maybe a Galapagos island situation where you just have these unique creatures that don't exist in the rest of the world. Japan has a little bit of this problem and can no longer compete outside of China. So this dual circulation thing, it's a decent response. I think there's some longer term risks there. And it's going to be a temptation. Let's just focus domestically. It's easier, it's big enough. Who needs all this hassle?
Professor Fu, how do you see that? To have the convenient choice or to have an important choice?
Well, my understanding of that is that when you look at the role of state vis-a-vis market, the other sentence is that we should let the market play a decisive role. In other words, while it's a gradual process, but the market has to go forward faster than the state. In terms of the balancing between domestic and international markets, to the extent that is politically feasible, China continues to go forward with the opening up. There may be debates about the speed, but my hunch is that, as I said, to the extent that the politically feasible, will push very hard towards internationalization, even though we say the word multilateralism. And the technology, science and the technology, a balance between inductive tinkering. In other words, you have the technology already existing globally, and we just want to passively learn. More towards deductive tinkering. In other words, mathematics, science, theory-oriented approach will play a bigger role than just be passive there and to absorb the things that's already there.
A lot of theoretical discussions over there, but if I could be just more specific, particularly for our audience sake, Professor, we have been watching very closely about this two dynamics development, as Mr. Townsend just mentioned. China looking at the internal market, but also looking at the international one. How do you see this dual circulation earlier named? How would they really interact with one another according to your reading of the 14th Five-Year Plan?
This is it's a new phrase for something China has been doing for a long time. You look at Shenzhen, it's a dual circulation economy. We use the word smiling curve. Design part, the market part, then the manufacturing part. China stayed at the manufacturing part, but in past 2 decades, been climbing up the smiling curve, design, marketing, and while we're doing that, you also see the mirror image of the smiling part. We also leverage the domestic part of our economy, such that the end result is Shenzhen has been progressing very rapidly. And we have learned the lessons. Now we use the new word, dual circulation economy. And I share the concerns that Jeff mentioned. The concerns that while we're saying that, do not slow down that process, or do not think that domestic market itself, because it's big, will do its own job. United States, for instance, while we are saying it's turning inward, if we look at the immigration rates, probably still the highest in the world. So do not get the wrong.
And you're watching World Insight special program on the 5th Plenary Session of the 19th CPC Central Committee and China's 14th Five-Year Plan. Stay with us. We'll be back after this. For the 14th Five-Year Plan and the latest insights and analysis about it, we are joined in Beijing, Fu Jun, the Academic Dean of the Institute for South Cooperation and Development with Peking University. In Shanghai, Leslie MAASDORP, President of the New Development Bank. And also in Singapore, Jim Rogers, world-renowned investor, Chairman of Rogers Holdings. And in Bangkok, last but not least, Jeffrey Townsend, Guanghua School of Management scholar with Peking University. We mentioned, we heard Mr. Han, the spokesperson for the 14th Five-Year Plan, talking about some specifics. Focusing on the internal market, he said, it's by no means a downgrade of opening up. Instead, he said, the pattern aims to promote a higher level of opening up by using two sources and two markets. That's an exact quote coming from the press conference just held on Monday. So, Mr. MAASDORP, you are reading the so-called dual circulation or dual dynamic development.
the idea of capitalizing on the strengths and of the sizable domestic market is very much well appreciated and understood. I mean, I think that in any event, that is the strength of this economy, which is now the second biggest in the world. However, I think, though, that it is very important for the next years to continue and, in fact, accelerate the process of specifically financial and capital markets reform, Tianwei, because I think within that lies the potential to spur the next phase of Chinese growth. As you know, the last 5 years, we've already seen incremental steps to open up this market more because, as you know, one of the peculiar factors about China's reform and opening up over the last 40 years is that it has opened up and globalized, but fundamentally the financial capital markets remained largely closed. That process sort of accelerated in 2017, 2018. Most of the restrictions on foreign companies have been lifted, but most of the financial sector, the bond markets, the equity markets, are still fundamentally domestic. You know, 98% of the interbank bond market, the third biggest bond market in the world, is actually owned by domestic institutions. So there's a potential for new capital inflows into China, both portfolio capital, foreign direct investment into China, if there's an acceleration of this reform. So it's important in this dual dynamic to continue the opening up, as Jim and others have already emphasized.
Well, of course, the Chinese financial institutions, IPOs inside the U.S., we have seen that a boom of that over the past few months, despite of the so-called trade war. Mr. Rogers, I'm sure you have a lot of insights into that. The dual circulation, internal, external.
As far as dual circulation, if you look at something like solar power or wind power, China has developed it enormously, electric vehicles, and now you can and are selling it abroad and developing it abroad. I mean, it's a dual market, partly because you developed it so much with a huge market, a huge internal market, and you went there, and that's what's happening. You know, back to finance, which a professor was talking about. You know, before the Second World War, Shanghai was the largest financial center between New York and London. Then it will be again. But China needs to open up more. It is opening. Don't get me wrong. You have been opening up a lot in the past several years. But someone just mentioned that there could be a lot more, and there could be. And Jack Ma is right. But other people are right, too. Just open it up and let the flies come in. Let the flies come in, but in the end,
flies, not many of them.
No, you let the flies come in.
Let the flies come in, but rather let the sunshine and the wind come in, right? You just said it, right?
You'll have both sunshine. You'll have sunshine, flies, but you'll also have some Jack Ma's. You'll have some Tencent. You'll have some solar power. You'll have a lot of things that the world needs and wants.
Professor Fu, tell me more about your thoughts. Besides the theoretical descriptions, could you give us some lights about, you know, how is China likely to do that, particularly at a time when there are a lot of uncertainties, whether geopolitics or immediate economic challenges? We heard both Mr. Wang Qishan and also some of the other top Chinese political figures talking about financial stability also. And about safety, security, financial security as well. So how should we see that balance in a way?
I'm a strong advocate for speed. I'm also a strong advocate for gradualism. There are two markets. Unless we develop the domestic market at the level of sophistication that is approximate the international markets, the most sophisticated market globally, you should have some concerns. But that said, we need to reform in a very serious way of the financial markets domestically. At the same time, we need to catch that up, to match it up with a balance between domestic market and the international market, such that while you're opening up, you also have a safety valve there. This is a very strong lesson for the success of Chinese economy in the past 40 years. I use the analogy of kids learning. You do not ask a kindergarten kids to learn graduate stuff. Primary school, middle school, high school, graduate level stuff. As I said, we are biologists. And a big lesson, if I compare China with the former Soviet Union, they just do some mathematical logic, and they go all the way overnight. And the results, empirical results, shows that probably this is not the way to go.
Global supply chain has been evolving. Well, there were, earlier assumption that it would change much more dramatically than it is actually changing now, but there is the potential of change. So, Mr. MAASDORP, how do you see the changes in that aspect, and where China is going to be? How do you see this plan, in a way, indicate about that?
It's fair to say, Tianwei, as we all probably agree on this panel, that this 5-year plan is taking place in the context of a much more challenging external environment, a lot more uncertainties. As you know, the IMF recently put out the World Economic Outlook and described a long, uneven, uncertain ascent meaning climbing. So the next period in the next few years is going to be extremely challenging. We should not underestimate the impact that macro context will have on the capacity to implement this plan. I guess what I'm also saying is that given the uncertainties associated with COVID and the longer-term economic repercussions on especially the rest of the world, that is going to impact on China, because China exports to the rest of the world, and therefore it is dependent on that demand to stimulate its economy here.
Be very swift and flexible. I guess that's the capability we need to have in order to face the uncertainty. Mr. Rogers, I see you in Russia, I see you in Vietnam, I see you in many other places. How do you see global supply chain changing, evolving, and also the uncertainties that Mr. MAASDORP just mentioned?
Well, as you know, Beijing has come up with a One Belt, One Road plan, which is going to be perhaps the most exciting thing in the 21st century, because it's going to change everything we know. It's not often that geography changes, but Beijing is now changing world geography, and it's going to open many markets. It's going to make many people more competitive than in the past. Deng Xiaoping said you cross the stream one step at a time, one stone at a time. But he also said you get across the stream. Back to Professor Fu, you don't wait around, you get across the stream. And maybe you do it carefully, but you do it. And that's what's happening with One Belt, One Road. It's changing everything. You've heard of Chicago. You've heard of Chicago because a railroad came along and changed geography. Well, that's what Beijing is doing now with One Belt, One Road. And you mentioned Vietnam, but whoever you want to mention, Russia, all of these countries are going to change dramatically because of the changes coming out of Beijing, especially with things like One Belt, One Road, and they are getting on with it. Fortunately, they're getting on with it.
There's one thing that is very crucial that China needs to face, gentlemen, as we speak. The economy is growing, there's many more uncertainties in the world, geopolitics evolving, and people are questioning, where is China? What does China want to do? How is China mapping us on their overall so-called 5-year plan? And so a communication job from Beijing to the rest of the world. And that's exactly what we are talking about today. We need to communicate, but how? About what? What should be, clarified. All these are crucial, and how they're being communicated. Mr. Towson, a huge challenge. You could have aspirations, but whether others really understand your aspiration and can go with you or support you or work with you, it's another question. Mr. Towson.
Yeah, I think in the last 3 years, this whole political issue between the U.S. and China, or China and, say, India or the EU, this is really a new thing. We didn't hear this 5 years ago, and I think a lot of this is just learning to have the discussion and learning to argue. When the trade tariff situation started, there was a lot of very strong language coming out of China and the U.S. That has pretty much faded away now. The meetings are happening. So I think we're in the early stages of two very different political economic systems, two different worldviews, learning to sort of argue a little bit, heated at times. But what we want is a situation where these, we don't have to agree on things, but we can't agree on nothing. There have to be areas of common ground, and we can agree on 1 through 3, and we'll argue on the others. I think we're in the early days of that. I think going forward will not be as heated as we've seen. And that's happening probably more in the U.S. because there was quite a bit of a knowledge gap in terms of China in the U.S., in D.C.
Mr. Rogers, the earlier generation, as some say, seem to have the wisdom. Dr. Henry Kissinger, in a recent talk, had been talking about China and the United States really need to work out some of the frameworks, so that they will not eventually come out of this frame and hurt one another's ultimate interests. Now, I know that's crucial at the very beginning of the Cold War, but many believe we shouldn't find a Cold War. So how should we, find the limits of this frame, and how should we work within a reasonable logic with one another, China and the United States, and also set a great example for the rest of the world? Mr. Rogers, some of these strategic questions we don't have to think about much earlier, but now we really do, and it's for the very first time for China to communicate with the rest of the world too.
The solution, obviously, is for everybody to watch Chen Wei on CGTN.
Thank you, sir. I know you would say that for me. Yes, go ahead, sir.
But, I mean, not just Americans, everybody needs to open up and learn from other people. I mean, I've been around the world a few times, and I've always found that people are afraid of foreigners until they go and dine and dance and drink beer. Then everybody's very happy, and we find that we're all the same. We don't have to fight. That is a very hard lesson. History shows that is extremely hard lesson. But the more you sit down and drink beer together, or Mao Tai, if you like Mao Tai, or tea, the happier we're all going to be, and the more we'll open up. Now, that's the problem, of course, Chen Wei. How do you get people to sit down and talk instead of yell at each other? When things are bad, politicians like to yell at foreigners. Therein lies the problem, and history shows it's a recurring problem. But come on, let's all go drink tea together. Yeah,
drink tea is better probably than getting drunk. But
certainly better than Mao Tai. I don't like Mao Tai.
Anyway, I wouldn't serve you Mao Tai next time you're in Beijing, but hopefully we can see each other more frequent. But a motorcycle ride around China wouldn't hurt, right? As your experience just showed decades ago. Having said that, though, Mr. MAASDORP, you are based in Shanghai. You are working with this multinational institution. You know how important also today communications needs to be done. So what do you make of that and China's increasingly learning curve about it?
Let me start out, Tian, by just agreeing wholeheartedly with what sounded like a light-hearted comment from Jim, but I think he's right, spot on in his remarks. I mean, as you know, when the world faced, the biggest crisis of its time at the end of the Second World War, after the devastation of Europe, out of that chaos, out of that calamity, came what institutions that have stood the test of time, where the IMF created in 1944 and was pretty much responsible for the financial and monetary stability we've had over the last 7 decades. We had the World Bank, which pretty much led the development path and reconstruction of Europe and many other countries that were devastated by the war. Where the World Trade Organization set in place the rules governing global trade and so on. So out of crisis, and we are still in the middle of a crisis now, we don't know how deep it's going to be, but the IMF says it's going to be extremely deep, and they're the most trusted source out there. So let's not underestimate the point that Jim made around, communication and keeping these multilateral actors talking all the time to search for solutions that goes beyond just the self-interest of individual nations. And there are elements and signals of that already, but I think it's really early days.
Before we go, very briefly, one sentence if you can. What are you looking forward in the next 5 years from China? And certainly China's with where you are. Mr. MAASDORP?
I would like to see a very clear, sustainable and green path outlined, which sets out the foundations for the next 15 years, which is when China will reach sort of carbon peak, and then the path towards carbon neutrality. The focus on how China will engineer this change away from its carbon intensity is very central to how the rest of the world will respond.
Okay, a brief sentence if you can, Professor Fu.
Okay, it's not something new that I say now. I hope China will continue to be part of a process that we call equitable, inclusive, sustainable growth. It's spelled out by the United Nations.
Okay. And Mr. Towson.
Digitized consumers connected in real time with smart logistics and increasingly smart manufacturing that goes from China to the rest of Asia.
That's your list. All right. And last but not least, Mr. Rogers.
Well, tomorrow morning or next week, you open the financial markets, you open the investment markets completely. If I want to buy German shares, I call up and buy them. Make your financial market as open, transparent, and liquid, and the world will be better off, and China will be better.
All right.
Open the window, open the window more. Get more flies.
All right. Get more shares, shall we wish. Mr. Rogers,
yes.
Mr. Towson, Mr. MAASDORP, and Professor Fu. Thank you so much for your insights and sharing your time. Really appreciate it. What a conversation. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, you can certainly search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.